The rain came down in sheets that May afternoon in 1945, turning the dirt road into a river of mud. Anna Weber clutched the small silver cross her mother had given her, feeling its edges press into her palm through the thin fabric of her pocket. At 26, she had seen more death than most people would witness in a lifetime. The wound on her forearm, hastily bandaged with torn cloth, throbbed with each step. Behind her, 23 other women trudged forward in silence. Some had been nurses like Anna. Others had worked as cooks in military facilities or served in auxiliary roles. A few had been actual soldiers, though Germany's desperation in the final months had blurred all traditional lines. Now they were simply prisoners defeated, exhausted, and terrified. "Keep moving," barked an American soldier, though his voice lacked real malice. He was young, probably no older than 19, and looked almost as tired as they did. Anna glanced at the woman beside her, Greta Hoffman, a cook from Hamburg who had fed troops on the Eastern Front. Greta's face was gaunt, her eyes sunken. They all looked like ghosts, Anna thought. Ghosts of a war that had finally consumed everything. "Do you think they'll shoot us?" whispered Lottie, a 20-year-old signals operator, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Quiet," Anna hissed, but she wondered the same thing. The rumors had spread through their ranks during the chaotic final days, stories of retribution, of American soldiers so enraged by what they'd found in the camps that mercy would be impossible. Anna had heard of Dachau, had seen the photographs passed around by officers trying to maintain morale even as the Reich crumbled. She knew what her country had done. What could they expect now but justice delivered through a rifle barrel? The convoy of trucks had brought them from southern Germany, through towns that barely existed anymore. Rubble and ash marked where homes had stood. Hollow-eyed children watched them pass. Anna had felt shame then, sharp and deep, cutting through her exhaustion. These were her people, and she had been part of the machine that destroyed them, even if only by feeding wounded soldiers or bandaging broken bodies. The camp appeared through the rain like an apparition, a cluster of buildings surrounded by fencing, but not the barbed wire she'd expected. It looked almost temporary, hastily constructed, but orderly. American flags hung limp in the downpour. Watchtowers stood at the corners, but they seemed more symbolic than threatening. The trucks stopped, and the women were ordered out. Anna's boots squelched in the mud as she climbed down, her injured arm protesting the movement. She kept her head up, refusing to show weakness. Pride was all she had left, foolish as that seemed now. An American officer stood waiting, rainwater streaming off his helmet. He held a clipboard and surveyed them with an expression Anna couldn't quite read. Not hatred, not contempt, something closer to weariness, or perhaps pity. "This way," he said in heavily accented German. The women followed, their wooden clogs and worn boots making soft sounds against the ground. The camp's interior was nothing like Anna had imagined. The buildings were clean, freshly painted even. Through one window, she glimpsed rows of cots with actual mattresses. Another building had a red cross painted on its side, a medical facility. Her heart beat faster. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick, some elaborate cruelty before the real punishment began. They were led into a long building that smelled of wood and something else, something that made Anna's stomach clench painfully. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until that moment. The scent was warm, inviting, completely at odds with everything she'd expected. "Wait here," the officer said, then left them alone. The women stood in silence, bunched together in the center of the room like sheep, too afraid to sit at the tables that lined the walls. Long wooden benches flanked each table, and the floor had been swept clean. Electric lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh but honest glow over everything. "It's a test," murmured Greta. "They're seeing if we'll try to escape." "Escape where?" Anna replied softly. "The war is over. There's nowhere left to run." Staff Sergeant John Miller stood in the camp kitchen, staring at the supplies he'd been given to work with. Cornmeal, butter, potatoes, canned meat. Coffee, more food than he'd seen in one place since leaving Kansas 2 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was supposed to feed the enemy with rations better than what most Americans had access to back home. His commanding officer, Captain Thomas Bradley, had been clear. The Geneva Convention applies. They're prisoners of war, not criminals. Feed them accordingly. John had nodded, but inside, his gut twisted. His older brother David had died at Normandy, cut down by German machine gun fire before he'd even made it off the beach. John had received the telegram 3 days before his own 18th birthday. He'd enlisted the following week, lying about his age, desperate to do something, anything, to make David's death mean something. Now here he was, 20 years old, a chef before the war and a field cook during it, ordered to prepare meals for women who'd served the regime that killed his brother. The logic was simple enough. These women hadn't been at Normandy. They weren't the ones who'd pulled triggers or dropped bombs. But logic and emotion rarely shared the same space in John's chest. "You all right, Miller?" asked Private Eddie Carson, another cook who'd been assigned to the prisoner detail. Eddie was from Louisiana, a jazz pianist who'd been drafted and somehow ended up peeling potatoes for the U.S. Army. "Fine," John said, though he wasn't. "Let's get started." The orders were to prepare a standard meal, nothing fancy, just filling and nutritious. But as John measured out cornmeal and greased baking pans, he found himself thinking about David, about the last letter his brother had sent home, where he'd written about sharing his chocolate ration with a French kid who was starving. "We're fighting for something bigger than revenge," David had written. "We're fighting so people can eat dinner with their families again." John's hands moved automatically, mixing batter, cutting butter into portions, setting coffee to brew in the large percolators. Eddie worked beside him, mashing potatoes with powdered milk and margarine. Another cook sliced the canned meat into thin portions, making it stretch further. "These krauts better appreciate this," Eddie muttered. "They're not krauts," John said quietly. "Not today. Today they're just hungry people." Eddie looked at him strangely but didn't argue. Captain Bradley entered the kitchen as they were loading the first trays. He was a thin man, older than most officers, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that suggested he'd seen too much. "How's it coming?" Bradley asked. "Should be ready in 10 minutes, sir," John replied. Bradley picked up a piece of cornbread, still warm from the oven, and examined it. "This is good work, Miller. Your mother teach you to cook?" "My grandmother, sir. She ran a diner in Topeka." "Well, she taught you well." Bradley set the cornbread down gently. "I know this isn't easy. Hell, none of this is easy. But humanity doesn't end just because a war does. Sometimes I think it's when the shooting stops that we find out what we're really made of." John didn't respond. He wasn't sure he agreed, but he also wasn't sure he disagreed. He just knew that in 10 minutes, he'd be carrying food to women who'd worn the uniform of the enemy, and he'd have to look them in the eye when he did it. "They're scared, you know," Bradley continued. "Terrified, actually. God knows what they've been told about us. Hell, God knows what we found in some of those camps. But these women..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. They were cogs in a machine. Maybe they believed in it. Maybe they didn't. But they're not the machine itself, and we're not becoming what we fought against by treating them like human beings. "Yes, sir," John said. Bradley left, and John returned to his work. He arranged the trays with care cornbread in the center, still steaming. A portion of mashed potatoes on one side, the sliced meat on the other, a pat of butter on top of the bread, coffee in a tin cup, with sugar and condensed milk on the side. It looked like something his grandmother would have served at the diner, a simple meal but made with attention. "Time to serve it up," Eddie said. John picked up 2 trays, feeling their weight in his hands. Through the kitchen door, he could see into the long dining hall where the women waited. They stood clustered together, their faces pale and drawn. Most looked like they expected to be shot at any moment. One woman caught his attention, dark hair pulled back in a braid, her right arm bandaged. She was staring out a window at something John couldn't see, her expression distant. There was something in her face, a mixture of resignation and defiance, that reminded him of photographs he'd seen of his grandmother as a young woman during the Depression. That same look of someone who'd been beaten down but refused to break entirely. He took a breath and pushed through the door, Eddie behind him with more trays. Other cooks followed, forming a line. They began setting the trays on the tables, the metal making soft clanking sounds against the wood. The women didn't move. They stared at the food as if it might attack them. Number. Part 3. Suspicion and silence. Anna watched the American soldiers place trays on the tables with movements that seemed almost ceremonial. Each tray held the same arrangement: yellow bread of some kind, white mashed substance, sliced meat, and a steaming cup of something dark. The smells that rose from the food made her dizzy. Beside her, Lotte trembled. "What is it?" she whispered in German. "Food, apparently," Anna replied, though she didn't believe it. This had to be a test. Perhaps the food was poisoned, or perhaps they were expected to refuse it, to maintain some dignity as prisoners, and their acceptance would be used as propaganda. Look how eagerly the defeated Germans eat from American hands. Greta stepped forward first, always the brave one. She'd survived the siege of Stalingrad by sheer force of will, had fed soldiers with frozen horse meat and sawdust bread. She looked at the nearest American soldier, a young man with dark hair and Kansas written all over his honest face, and spoke in broken English. "We eat?" The soldier nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Please, sit down, ma'am." Anna almost laughed. They were being called ma'am like they were guests at a restaurant instead of prisoners of war. The absurdity of it made her head spin. Slowly, carefully, the women moved to the tables. Anna found herself sitting across from the dark-haired soldier, the one who'd spoken to Greta. He set a tray in front of her with surprising gentleness, and their eyes met for just a moment. His were brown, tired, but not unkind. She looked away quickly. The food sat before her, steam rising in delicate wisps. The yellow bread, cornbread, she would later learn smelled sweet and savory at once. The butter was melting into it, creating small golden pools. Anna's mouth watered so intensely it hurt, but she couldn't move. Her hands remained in her lap, gripping her skirt. Around her, the other women were equally frozen. 24 prisoners and 24 trays of food, and not one of them could bring herself to take a bite. "What if it's drugged?" murmured someone down the table. "Or poisoned," added another voice. Anna looked at the cornbread again. Memory ambushed her. She was 8 years old in Munich, in her mother's kitchen. Her mother was making Maisbrot, a cornbread recipe she'd learned from a friend who'd emigrated to America before the First War. The smell had been similar, warm and comforting. Anna had sat at the kitchen table, swinging her legs, while her mother hummed and mixed batter in a yellow bowl. That life seemed like it had belonged to someone else. That Anna, the child who'd been safe and loved, and hadn't yet seen what humans could do to each other, was gone. But the smell of cornbread remained, a bridge across an impossible distance. The American soldiers had retreated to the edges of the room, watching but not approaching. The dark-haired cook stood near the kitchen door, his face unreadable. Anna noticed his hands were clenched at his sides, as if he was restraining himself from something. Anger? Disgust? She couldn't tell. Greta finally broke the paralysis. She picked up the fork beside her tray, took a deep breath, and cut a piece of the cornbread. She raised it to her mouth slowly, as if expecting it to burst into flames. Instead, she bit down, chewed, swallowed. Her eyes widened, then filled with tears. "Gott," she whispered. "Gott, I am Himmel." She took another bite, then another, and suddenly she was crying openly, her shoulders shaking. The other women stared at her in shock. "It's real," Greta sobbed in German. "It's real food. They're actually feeding us." Anna's hand moved before her mind fully processed the decision. She picked up her fork, cut a corner from the cornbread, and brought it to her lips. The texture was soft, slightly crumbly. The taste hit her tongue sweet, buttery, with a hint of salt and the earthy flavor of corn. It was still warm. Something broke inside her chest. A dam she'd been holding in place through sheer will suddenly shattered, and a sob escaped her throat. She tried to swallow the bite but could barely manage it past the tears. Around her, the sound of crying spread like fire through dry grass. Lottie wept into her hands, the fork forgotten. Maria Schmidt, a communications officer who'd maintained rigid composure through capture and transport, dropped her face to the table and shook with sobs. Even the harder women, the ones who'd maintained fierce pride, found their eyes burning. They weren't crying from hunger, though hunger was certainly part of it. They weren't crying from relief at not being poisoned, though that relief was real. They were crying because, in that moment, they were being treated as human beings. Not monsters, not animals, not convenient corpses, just people who needed food. Anna took another bite, forcing herself to chew and swallow despite the tears streaming down her face. The mashed potatoes were creamy and rich. The meat was tender, seasoned simply, but well. The coffee was hot and strong, sweetened just enough to take the edge off the bitterness. "I thought they'd beat us," Lottie said between sobs, her voice cracking. "I thought they'd make us suffer for what we did." "We did nothing," protested one of the younger women. "Didn't we?" Anna heard herself say. The words came out harsh, unexpected. "We wore the uniform. We followed orders. We kept the machine running, even when we knew." She stopped, unable to finish. What had they known? What had she known? She'd heard rumors, seen things that didn't make sense, encounters that suggested something terrible happening just outside her field of vision. But she'd told herself it was propaganda, exaggeration, the fog of war obscuring truth. Now she sat in an American prison camp, eating cornbread and crying, and the truth was undeniable in its absence from her excuses. "They're feeding us like humans," whispered Greta, staring at her tray as if it might disappear. "After everything, they're feeding us like we matter." Anna looked up through her tears and saw the American soldiers watching them. The dark-haired cook was still by the kitchen door, and his face had changed. The tension in his jaw had softened. His clenched hands had relaxed. He looked. She couldn't quite name the expression. Sad? Relieved? Vindicated somehow? Their eyes met again, and this time neither looked away immediately. Anna saw something in his gaze that she hadn't expected understanding. Maybe. Or perhaps shared sorrow. He had lost someone, she realized. She could see it in the way he stood, in the careful distance he maintained from hope. Anna set down her fork and impulsively pressed her hand to her chest in a gesture of gratitude. Then she touched her fingers to her lips and extended them toward him, a small motion, almost invisible, but deliberate. "Thank you." The soldier's throat worked. He nodded once, a barely perceptible dip of his chin, then turned and disappeared back into the kitchen. Number. Part 5. The Silent Men. John leaned against the kitchen counter, his hands gripping the edge hard enough to hurt. Through the small window in the door, he could hear the crying. It hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown stronger, a chorus of weeping that filled the dining hall like a hymn in a church. "Jesus Christ," Eddie muttered beside him. "What the hell is happening out there?" "They're crying because we fed them," John said quietly. "Because we treated them like people instead of monsters." "They are the enemy," Eddie said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Were," John corrected. "They were the enemy. Now they're just defeated." He thought about David again. But this time the memory was different. Not David dying on a beach in France, but David at their grandmother's diner, helping serve breakfast to hobos and drifters during the Depression. Their grandmother had a strict policy: anyone who came to the back door hungry got fed. No questions asked, no judgment rendered. David had once asked her why. "Because feeding people is the most basic act of humanity," she'd said. "When you give someone food, you're saying, 'I see you. You exist. You matter.' Sometimes that's all people need to remember: they're human." John had been maybe 10 years old when she'd said that. He'd thought it was naive then, simplistic. Now, listening to German women cry over cornbread, he understood exactly what his grandmother had meant. Captain Bradley entered the kitchen through the back door, his uniform spotted with rain. He must have been making rounds of the camp. He looked at John and Eddie, then toward the dining hall. "Are they eating?" Bradley asked. "Yes, sir," John replied. and crying. Bradley's expression shifted, something complicated passing across his features. I suspected they might. The last camp I worked at, we had a group of Italian POWs. First meal, same thing happened. Not quite this intense, but similar. Something about being fed when you expect to be starved, it breaks through defenses. Should we do anything, sir? Eddie asked. Let them cry. Bradley said simply. Let them eat. Let them remember what it feels like to be treated with basic decency. Maybe they'll carry that memory forward when they go home. Whenever that is. He walked to the window and looked through, watching the scene in the dining hall. John joined him. The women were eating now. Despite the tears, they ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if the food might vanish if they moved too quickly. Some had stopped crying and sat in stunned silence. Others still wept quietly while they chewed. The woman with the bandaged arm, the one John had served first, had composed herself somewhat. She was breaking her cornbread into small pieces, eating methodically. But her eyes were distant, fixed on something beyond the walls of the camp. That one, Bradley said, nodding toward her. She was a nurse. Anna Weber. Found her papers. She was stationed at a field hospital near Munich. No war crimes in her file, no suspicious activities. Just another nurse trying to keep soldiers alive. Like David, John said before he could stop himself. Bradley glanced at him. Your brother? Yes, sir. He was a medic, died at Normandy. I'm sorry, son. Bradley was quiet for a moment. You know what I think? I think your brother would approve of this. Of feeding them. Men who choose to save lives instead of take them, they understand that enemies are temporary, but humanity is permanent. John wasn't sure that was true. He wasn't sure David would approve at all, but he wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that his brother's death had been for something more than revenge, more than victory. He wanted to believe it had been for the possibility of moments like this where former enemies could sit together, sharing bread, remembering their common humanity. Private Richards said something to me earlier. Bradley continued. Said he didn't understand why we were wasting good food on them. I told him what I'll tell you both. Humanity isn't a resource that depletes. Being decent to prisoners doesn't mean we're being indecent to our own. It means we're proving what we were fighting for in the first place. The right for all people to live with dignity. Eddie nodded slowly. My grandmother used to say something similar. About how cruelty was like a disease, it spread from person to person until everyone was infected. But kindness could spread too, if you let it. Smart woman, your grandmother, Bradley said. He turned from the window. Miller, tomorrow I want you to teach some of them how to help in the kitchen. The ones who worked as cooks, it'll give them something to do. Help them feel useful. And it'll give us extra hands. Yes, sir, John said. Though the idea made him nervous. Working alongside German women. Teaching them American recipes. Sharing space and tools, it felt too intimate somehow. Too much like forgiveness when he wasn't sure forgiveness was his to give. But orders were orders, and part of him, a part he didn't fully understand yet, was curious. He wanted to know their stories, wanted to understand how people ended up on different sides of a war. Whether the differences were really as vast as propaganda suggested, or whether they were just accidents of birth and geography. Through the window, he watched Anna Weber take a sip of coffee. She closed her eyes, and for just a moment, her face relaxed. She looked younger than he'd initially thought, probably close to his own age. There were lines around her eyes, though, marks of exhaustion and stress that seemed carved into her features. She opened her eyes and caught him watching. Instead of looking away ashamed, she held his gaze. There was a question in her eyes, something she wanted to ask but couldn't across the barrier of language and circumstance. John found himself nodding to her, a small gesture of acknowledgement. I see you, the nod said. You exist. You matter. She pressed her hand to her chest again, then returned to her meal. John turned away from the window, his heart beating harder than it should have been. 3 days after the first meal, Anna sat on her cot with a piece of paper and a stubby pencil. The camp commander had distributed writing materials and said the women could write letters home, though he couldn't promise when or if the letters would be delivered. Germany was in chaos, mail service essentially non-existent, and many addresses no longer existed at all. Still, Anna wrote, the act of forming words on paper felt important, even if her mother never received them. Dearest Muti, I don't know if you'll ever read this letter. I don't know if you're still alive, if our house still stands, if Munich exists as anything more than rubble, but I need to write to you anyway. I need to tell you what happened here, because I think it changed something in me. The Americans captured us on the 8th of May, the day the war ended. We were terrified. We'd heard such stories that they would rape us, beat us, leave us to starve as punishment for what Germany did. I won't pretend I didn't understand why they might want to hurt us. We wore the uniform. We served the regime. We kept the wheels turning even when we suspected terrible things were happening just beyond our sight. But when we arrived at the camp, something unexpected occurred. They fed us. Not scraps or stale bread, but real food. Warm cornbread with butter, mashed potatoes, coffee with sugar. I thought it was a trick at first. We all did. But it wasn't. They were simply feeding us because we were hungry. I cried, Moody. We all cried. Not from hunger, though God knows we were hungry. We cried because someone was showing us mercy when we didn't deserve it. Because after all the cruelty, all the death, all the hatred, someone chose to be kind. There's a soldier here who cooks. He's young, probably my age. He has sad eyes, like he's lost someone. I think he has every reason to hate me, but he doesn't. Or if he does, he doesn't let it guide his actions. He feeds us like we're his family. He adds extra butter to the bread. He makes sure the coffee is hot. These small acts of care, they're more powerful than any weapon. I'm ashamed, Muti. Ashamed of what our country became. Ashamed that I didn't resist harder. Ashamed that I believed the lies for so long. But I'm also grateful. Grateful to be alive. Grateful to remember what human decency looks like. I hope I can come home to you. I hope Munich still exists. I hope we can rebuild something better from the ashes. And I hope I never forget the taste of cornbread, or the lesson it taught me about choosing kindness over cruelty. Your daughter, Anna. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside with the others she'd written. Across the room, Greta was writing too, her pencil moving rapidly across the page. Most of the women were writing letters to mothers, fathers, siblings, anyone who might still be alive to read them. What are you telling them? Lottie asked, looking up from her own letter. The truth, Anna said. That we're being treated well, that the Americans are feeding us, that maybe humanity isn't dead after all. My brother won't believe it, Lottie said. He'll think I'm writing under duress, saying what they force me to say. Then let him think that, Greta said from her cot. But at least you told the truth. At least someone will know. That evening, during dinner, another meal of simple but nourishing food, Anna noticed the dark-haired cook watching them again. He did that sometimes. Stood at the kitchen door and observed them eating. Not in a creepy way, she decided. More like he was trying to understand something. Solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. She caught his eye and smiled slightly. It felt strange, smiling at an American soldier, but it also felt right somehow, like a small act of rebellion against all the propaganda she'd been fed about the inhuman enemy. He looked startled by her smile, then cautiously smiled back. It transformed his face, made him look even younger and infinitely less sad. You're flirting with him, Greta whispered, amused. I'm not, Anna protested, feeling her face heat. I'm just being polite. You can be both, Greta said with a soft laugh. God knows we could all use something to smile about. Later that week, something unexpected happened. Captain Bradley called Anna and 3 other women, including Greta, to his office. Through an interpreter, he explained that they were being assigned to help in the kitchen. The camp was receiving more prisoners, and the cooking staff needed assistance. Anna's first instinct was to refuse. Working in the kitchen meant working directly with American soldiers, including the dark-haired cook whose name she still didn't know. It felt too intimate, too much like collaboration. But then she thought about the cornbread. about the small kindnesses that had been extended to her, about the letters she'd written, if she wanted to rebuild something better from the ashes, if she wanted to practice the humanity she'd been shown, then perhaps this was where it started, in a kitchen making food, choosing to help rather than resist. "I'll do it," she said in halting English. The other women agreed as well, and the next morning, they reported to the kitchen. John Miller watched the 4 German women enter the kitchen with obvious nervousness. They stood just inside the door, bunched together like they expected to be attacked. The tallest one, Greta, according to the roster, had her chin up in defiance, but her hands shook slightly. Anna Weber stood beside her, those dark eyes taking in every detail of the space. "Morning," John said, then realized they probably didn't understand. He pointed to himself. "John." Then he gestured to them with a questioning look. "Greta," said the tall one, pointing to herself. She indicated the others in turn. "Anna, Frida, Catherine." "Good," John said. He pointed to the cornmeal, flour, and potatoes stacked on the counter. Work? They understood that much. Greta stepped forward first, always the brave one, and moved to the potatoes. She picked up a peeling knife, testing its weight, then began to work with the efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. The others followed her lead, each finding a task that needed doing. John worked alongside them, at first maintaining careful distance. But as the morning progressed, he found himself naturally moving closer, showing them where supplies were kept, demonstrating how he liked the cornbread mixed. Communication happened through gestures and simple words, but somehow they managed. Anna was the first to laugh. John had been trying to explain how much butter to add to the potatoes, using increasingly absurd hand gestures. When she suddenly giggled, the sound was unexpected and bright, cutting through the tension that had filled the kitchen. "Too much," she said in careful English, pointing to his exaggerated gesture. "You say, too much." "Yes," John admitted, grinning despite himself. "Maybe a little too much." Eddie Carson, working at the far end of the kitchen, stared in amazement. Did they just laugh together? He asked no one in particular. By the afternoon, something had shifted. Not friendship exactly. The war was too recent. The wounds too fresh, but a kind of working partnership. They moved around each other with growing ease, passing utensils and ingredients, checking each other's work. Greta turned out to have strong opinions about seasoning. She tasted the soup John was making, wrinkled her nose, and added salt without asking permission. When he tasted it again, he had to admit she was right. "Better," he said, nodding approval. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Good. You learn." The language barrier remained, but they developed a shorthand. Pointing, gesturing, the occasional shared word that both languages recognized. Coffee was universal. Bread was nearly the same. Numbers could be counted on fingers. Anna proved to be the fastest learner. She picked up English words with surprising speed, repeating them carefully until her pronunciation improved. John found himself teaching her without really meaning to, naming things as he used them, correcting her gently when she got something wrong. "This?" she asked, holding up a measuring cup. "Cup," he said. "Measuring cup. Measuring cup," she repeated slowly. "For how much?" "For measuring. Knowing how much of something to use." He demonstrated, scooping flour into the cup, leveling it off. "Ah," she said, understanding lighting her face. "We have also, but different word." She said something in German he couldn't understand, but he got the general idea. One afternoon, while teaching her to make coffee the American way, John caught himself telling her about his grandmother's diner. He didn't mean to. The words just came out. "My grandmother, she made coffee. Very strong. She said weak coffee was an insult to God." Anna's English was still limited, but she seemed to grasp the meaning. She smiled. "My mother also. Strong coffee," she say. She paused, searching for words, then switched to German, looking frustrated. Frida, who spoke a bit more English, Translated, her mother says coffee should wake the dead. John laughed, and Anna's face brightened at the sound. Yes, she said. Wake the dead, is right? That's right, John confirmed. Your English is getting better. She looked pleased, then suddenly shy. It struck him how young she was, how much life had been stolen from all of them by the war. She should have been worrying about normal things, romance, career, family. Instead, she was learning English in a prison camp, trying to find common ground with former enemies. As weeks passed, the kitchen became its own small world. News from outside filtered in. The war in the Pacific was still going. Germany was being divided, refugees were flooding across Europe, but inside the kitchen, life was simpler. There was flour to be measured, bread to be baked, vegetables to be chopped. They began exchanging recipes. Greta taught John how to make proper German potato pancakes. Anna showed him a strudel recipe her grandmother had used. In return, John taught them cornbread variations, American biscuits, and his grandmother's secret for making gravy. Your grandmother was wise woman, Greta said one day, her English improving. She teach you to cook with love. John felt his throat tighten. She taught me a lot of things. The conversations grew more personal over time. Carefully, respectfully, they began to share their stories. Not the politics, those wounds were still too raw, but the human details. Anna talked about growing up in Munich, about her mother's garden and her father's bookshop. John talked about Kansas, about wheat fields and summer storms. They discovered absurd similarities. Both had childhood dogs that hated baths. Both had been terrible at mathematics in school. Both loved the smell of bread baking more than almost any other scent. It's strange, Anna said one evening, her English now confident enough for real conversation. Before war, I think American people are very different. The propaganda say you are shallow, cruel, but you are just people, like us. Yeah, John said quietly. War makes it easy to forget that. My country forgot many things, Anna said, her voice heavy. We forget that other people are people. We forget kindness. We forget. She struggled for the word. Mercy. But you remembered, John said. You're here, learning, trying. Because you show me, Anna replied. The cornbread. The first meal. You show me that mercy is still real. The tension came from an unexpected direction. A new group of prisoners arrived in mid-June, German POWs from farther east, including several women who had been more deeply involved in Nazi party activities. They were harder, angrier, and viewed the existing prisoners with contempt. Anna first noticed it during dinner. A woman named Helga, maybe 40 years old with sharp features and sharper eyes, surveyed the meal with obvious disdain. She sat with her group, speaking in loud German that clearly wasn't meant to be private. Look at them, Helga said, gesturing toward Anna and the others. Eating American food like grateful dogs. Have they no pride? No loyalty? Greta stiffened beside Anna. Ignore her, she whispered, but Helga wasn't done. Germany may have lost the war, but that doesn't mean we have to lose our dignity. We should refuse this food. Show them we can't be bought with butter and bread. Then starve, Greta said sharply, loud enough for the whole room to hear. See how long your pride sustains you. Helga's group turned to stare. The dining hall, which had been filled with quiet conversation, fell silent. John and the other American soldiers tensed, hands moving toward their rifles though they didn't raise them. Anna felt something shift inside her, a decision crystallizing. She stood up slowly, drawing attention to herself. Her legs shook, but she kept her voice steady. You want to know why we eat their food, she said in German, addressing Helga but speaking to the whole room. Because they offered it. Because when we arrived here terrified and starving, expecting punishment, they gave us warm meals instead. Not scraps, not moldy bread, real food, prepared with care. They're the enemy, Helga spat. No, Anna said firmly. We were the enemy. Past tense. The war is over. Germany surrendered. And do you know why? Because we lost. Because the regime we served committed unspeakable acts. Because we were on the wrong side. Gasps rippled through the room. Several of the newer prisoners looked furious, but many of the women who'd been there since May nodded in agreement. I wore the uniform, Anna continued. I followed orders. I told myself I was just doing my duty, just helping wounded soldiers. But I knew, deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I heard the rumors about the camps. I saw the cattle cars. I chose not to see, not to know, because seeing and knowing would have required me to act, and I was too afraid. Her voice broke, but she pushed on. So now I'm here, and yes, I eat their food. I eat it gratefully, because it reminds me that humanity still exists, that mercy is still possible, that maybe I can become something better than what I was. Helga stood up, her face red with anger. You're a traitor to Germany. Germany is gone, Anna said quietly. The Germany you remember doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it never really did. Maybe it was always a dream hiding a nightmare. So I'm not a traitor to Germany. I'm choosing to be loyal to something more important than a country. I'm choosing humanity. The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, Greta stood. Then Frida. Then Catherine. One by one, most of the women who'd been in the camp since May rose to their feet, standing with Anna. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. The message was clear. John, who had been watching from the kitchen door, felt something swell in his chest. Captain Bradley had appeared beside him at some point, drawn by the commotion. They watched as Anna sat back down, her hands trembling, and picked up her fork. She took a deliberate bite of cornbread, chewed, swallowed. The other women followed her lead. Helga and her group remained standing for another moment, then sat down grudgingly. They didn't touch their food, but they didn't leave either. Did you understand what she said? Bradley asked John quietly. No, sir. My German's not that good. One of the translators was listening. She basically told them that eating our food doesn't make them traitors, it makes them human. That the war is over and it's time to choose humanity over ideology. John looked at Anna, who was eating mechanically now, her eyes fixed on her plate. She's brave. She's something. Bradley agreed. Most people would have kept their heads down. She stood up and said what needed to be said. That evening, John found a reason to seek Anna out. She was in the recreation area, staring out a window at the darkening sky. He approached carefully, not wanting to startle her. Anna, he said softly. She turned, and he saw that her eyes were red from crying. John. Hello. I heard what you said at dinner. Well, I heard you said something important. The translator told me. She looked embarrassed. I am sorry. I make, how you say, scene. You made a scene, yes. But it was the right scene to make. He paused, trying to find the right words. You were brave. You told the truth, even when it was dangerous. Not dangerous, she said. Just difficult, but necessary. Those women, they want to hold to the old ways. But old ways bring us here. To war. To death. To, she gestured helplessly. To all this, my grandmother used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you're terrified. Anna smiled slightly. Your grandmother sound like wise woman. Like my mother. They would be friends, I think. Yeah, John said. I think they would. They stood in silence for a moment, watching twilight settle over the camp. Finally, Anna spoke again. John, why you are kind to us. We are enemy. We serve the regime that kill many people. You must hate us. John had asked himself that question many times. He thought about David, about his grandmother, about Captain Bradley's words about humanity being permanent while enemies were temporary. I don't hate you, he said carefully. I hate what the regime did. I hate the war, the death, all of it. But you're not the regime. You're just a person who got caught up in something terrible. And yeah, maybe you made some bad choices. But you're trying to do better now. That matters. My brother died in this war, Anna said quietly. He was 17. He believe everything they tell him. He die believing he fight for something good. I am angry at them for this, for taking my brother and making him die for lies. I lost my brother too, John said. At Normandy. He was 19. Their eyes met, and in that moment, John understood that grief was universal. Loss transcended nationality. Pain spoke a language everyone understood. I am sorry, Anna said. I'm sorry too, John replied. They stood together in the fading light, two people from opposite sides of a war, united by the simple fact of their shared humanity. The announcement came in August. Germany would begin accepting prisoners back, and the women in the camp would be repatriated in stages. Those who had homes to return to would go first. Those whose towns had been destroyed would be sent to refugee processing centers. Anna received her assignment in late August. She would leave in 3 days, bound for Munich. Whether her mother was still alive, whether her home still stood, she had no way of knowing, but at least she would find out. The night before she was scheduled to leave, the kitchen staff organized a small farewell. It wasn't official. Captain Bradley looked the other way while John and the others prepared a special meal. Cornbread, of course, but also roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from the camp garden, and even a simple cake. You don't have to do this, Anna said when she saw the preparations. We want to, John said. You've become part of the team. We're going to miss you. Eddie Carson grinned. Who else is going to tell Miller his coffee is too weak? It is too weak, Greta said, laughing. Always too weak. They ate together that evening, American soldiers and German prisoners, sharing a meal not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The conversation was a mix of English and German, with lots of laughter and only a few tears. Toward the end of the meal, John disappeared into the back room and returned with a package wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Anna. For your journey, he said. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a loaf of cornbread, still slightly warm, wrapped in clean cloth. Beneath it was a piece of paper with a recipe written in careful English, translated into approximate German underneath. So you can remember, John said quietly. Anna's eyes filled with tears. I will never forget. How can I forget? I don't know what's waiting for you in Munich, John continued. I don't know if things will be easy or hard, but I want you to have this. To remember that people can be kind, that mercy exists, that humanity survives, even after everything. Anna clutched the package to her chest. Thank you. For the food, yes, but more than food. For treating us like we matter. For showing me that I can be more than what I was. The next morning, a truck arrived to transport the first group of released prisoners. Anna stood with her small bundle of belongings, the cornbread package wrapped carefully inside. Greta, Frida, and Catherine stood with her. They were all leaving together. John and Eddie came out to say goodbye. The camp had assembled American soldiers on one side, German prisoners on the other. It could have been a scene from any war, victor and vanquished separated by an invisible line. But then Anna did something unexpected. She walked across that line, directly to John, and extended her hand. He took it, shaking formally, and she said in careful English, "Thank you for first meal. Thank you for showing me how to be human again." John's throat worked. "Good luck, Anna. I hope Munich is still there. I hope your mother is waiting. I hope so too." She paused, then added, "If I have daughter someday, I tell her this story, about the war that end, and the men who choose kindness." She released his hand and started to turn away, but John spoke again. "Anna, wait." He pulled something from his pocket, a small photograph of the kitchen crew, taken a few weeks earlier. Anna was in it, laughing at something Greta had said, flour dusted across her apron. "So you don't forget us either," he said. She took the photograph with trembling hands, studied it for a long moment, then carefully tucked it into her pocket next to the cross her mother had given her. "I will not forget," she promised. Never. The truck's engine roared to life. The women climbed aboard, sitting on wooden benches in the back. As the truck pulled away, Anna looked back at the camp, at the American soldiers standing at attention, at John Miller watching her go, at the kitchen where she'd learned that humanity could survive even the worst of wars. She raised her hand in farewell. John raised his in return. The truck rounded a corner, and the camp disappeared from view. 15 years later, Munich had rebuilt itself. Not completely, scars of the war still showed in empty lots and rebuilt neighborhoods that looked too new beside older structures. But the city lived again. Anna Weber stood in her small bakery on a quiet street near the Marienplatz. The shop was modest but successful, known throughout the neighborhood for its excellent bread, and particularly its cornbread, an unusual item in a German bakery, but one that drew curious customers and kept loyal ones returning. On the wall beside the oven hung a faded photograph in a simple frame. It showed a young woman in an American military camp, laughing, flour on her apron, surrounded by people from both sides of what had been the worst war in human history. Beside it was a recipe, yellowed with age, written in 2 languages. A customer entered, a journalist doing a piece on small businesses in Munich's recovery. She noticed the photograph and asked about it. Anna smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. She was 41 now, her dark hair showing threads of gray, but her eyes still held the same fierce light they'd had at 26. That photograph, Anna said, is from a prison camp in America at the end of the war. I was a prisoner, a German nurse, captured when Germany fell. The journalist looked surprised. You were a prisoner of war, but you're smiling in the picture. Yes, Anna said simply, because by the time that photograph was taken, I'd remembered what it meant to be human. She told the story then about the fear during the transport, about expecting punishment and receiving mercy instead, about the first meal that had broken through years of propaganda and hatred, about John Miller and the cornbread that tasted like hope. That first meal, Anna said, touching the photograph gently, changed everything. Not just for me, but for many of us. We expected to be treated as we had treated others, with cruelty, with vindictiveness. Instead, they fed us. They showed us kindness when we didn't deserve it, and in doing so, they taught us something more valuable than any punishment could have. They taught us that we could choose to be better. Do you still have the recipe? The journalist asked. Anna laughed. I've made cornbread nearly every day for 15 years. I don't need the recipe anymore. But I keep it on the wall to remember that mercy tastes like cornbread, that humanity survives even the worst darkness, that people can choose kindness over cruelty. Have you ever tried to contact the American soldier? John Miller? Anna's smile turned wistful. No. I think he gave me what I needed, and I gave him something in return, proof that his choice to be kind mattered. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the lesson is more important than the continuing connection. She moved to the counter and wrapped a piece of cornbread in brown paper, just as John had done 15 years earlier. She handed it to the journalist. Here, for your article. Tell people that in 1945, after the worst war in history, a group of American soldiers chose to feed their enemies instead of starving them. Tell them that one meal, one simple act of human decency changed lives. Tell them that mercy tastes like cornbread, and that we should never forget it. The journalist took the package, feeling its warmth through the paper. This is an extraordinary story. It's a human story, Anna corrected gently. And that's what makes it extraordinary. We had stopped seeing each other as human Germans and Americans, enemies defined by flags and uniforms. But in a kitchen, over bread and coffee, we remembered. We remembered that before we were enemies, we were people, and that after the war ended, we were still people, still capable of kindness, still connected by the simple fact of our shared humanity. That evening, after the bakery closed, Anna sat alone with a piece of cornbread and a cup of strong coffee. Sunlight slanted through the western window, casting golden light across the old photograph. She studied the faces there: Greta, who ran a restaurant in Hamburg now; John Miller, whose life she'd never learned; Captain Bradley, who'd made the choice to enforce Geneva with compassion; and herself, younger and damaged, but beginning to heal. "Thank you," she whispered to the photograph. "For the meal. For the mercy. For reminding me what it means to be human." She broke a piece of cornbread, felt its familiar texture, tasted its familiar flavor. 15 years, and it still tasted like forgiveness, like possibility. Like the moment when she'd realized that despite everything, despite the war, despite the hatred, despite the terrible things both sides had done, humanity could survive. Mercy tasted like cornbread, and Anna Weber would spend the rest of her life ensuring that no one who entered her bakery would forget it. Outside, Munich continued its evening rhythm. People walked home from work. Children played in reconstructed playgrounds. Life went on, as it always did, carrying forward the lessons of the past, whether people remembered them or not. But Anna remembered. She would always remember. And in remembering, she would keep alive the truth that John Miller had taught her with that first warm meal. That kindness was stronger than cruelty. That mercy was more powerful than revenge. And that the simple act of feeding someone, of seeing them, acknowledging their existence, treating them as human, could change the world, one meal at a time.